Anyway, thank you to all of you for coming. I'm sure we're going to have a really lovely evening this evening. I'd just like to mention Jacana up front. Jacana are the publishers of the Splendid Tapestry of African Life. Bridget Impey is the publishing director there, and she called me today just to say please to send her apologies to everybody here tonight that there is no one here from Jacana tonight. The reason for that is that they are a very small, very feisty little independent publisher with a very small staff complement, and the wonderful Maggie Davey, who really has been the driving force behind Jacana since its inception, has been in hospital for quite a few weeks now. So there are people running around picking up things and stressing about things and doing other people's jobs, and apparently everyone has now got flu. So I'd like to wish Jacana the very best, and in particular, I'm sending all our best wishes to Maggie Davey. It's wonderful to welcome you here tonight, Adekeye Adebajo, to launch this wonderful collection of essays on all things African. It's an amazing, diverse collection that includes writings on everything from politics to art to sport to foreign policy, the whole lot. So congratulations, and lovely to have you back here at Love Books. Adekeye is a well-known academic and author. He's a senior research fellow and professor at the University of Pretoria Centre for Advancement of Scholarship in South Africa. Chatting to him tonight is the lovely Joanne Joseph. Joanne hardly needs an intro. She's a well-known journalist, broadcaster, and TV presenter. She's the author of 2 books, a work of non-fiction called Drug Muled, and Children of Sugarcane, a work of fiction. A wonderful book that we have not had on our shelves for 4 years. It's been selling ever since it was published. It was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Awards when it was published. And I think it's time for another one, Joanne. Anyway, over to the two of you.
Thank you so much for that lovely, warm introduction, Kate. And it is always such a joy to come to Love Books. There is a warm welcome here. It is such a cozy little store. I love the intimacy of this venue, and I love how close it brings one to the people who are interacting over the love of a book. So firstly, I just want to show you, Adekeye actually brought me this gift this evening, Global Africa. Just for your information, this is the book that precedes the one we're talking about tonight. So if you want to get the full picture, Kate, I think you need to stock a couple of these as well. If you don't, you do wonderful. Okay, so if you want to get the whole picture, buy both, please. Okay, and then of course we are looking at this amazing book tonight, The Splendid Tapestry of African Life. And you know, I really had to read it in bite-sized chunks because it's not an easy book to digest. You do need time. You need time to process what Ade is saying in this book. You need a great deal of interest, I think, in the continent as well. But when we talk about a splendid tapestry, not just the splendid tapestry of Africa, it is the splendid tapestry that Ade has put together in this book about African life, which I have really loved reading. And so, Ade, I want to thank you for that, because my knowledge about our own continent has grown by leaps and bounds since I read this book, and it really is a brilliant piece of work. And I'm now having to share this with my daughter, who's an international relations student. So every now and then it just disappears off my bedside table. And if you're as exercise averse as I am, in between reading, you can use it as a barbel as well. But it's wonderful. Ade, thank you for this opportunity to interview you again. We were at the Kingsmead Book Fair earlier this year, and so I feel very privileged to be asked to speak to Ade about this book again. So I'm going to dive right in, Ade. This is a continent you love. It's a continent you have explored deeply. You have walked in the streets of so many of the countries you've written about here. And one of the things that you're criticizing in this book is The Economist's cover title from a few years ago, May 2000, in fact, The Hopeless Continent, based on its Africa correspondent Richard Dowden's article. What upsets you about Afro-pessimism?
Thank you, Joanne, and good evening, everybody. I thought that Economist cover, which I read while I was a graduate student at Oxford, just epitomized everything. Oh, okay. Sorry, that wasn't on, but I think my voice is loud. Uh, I think it epitomized everything that is bad about Western journalism and their stereotyping of Africa. It was like the worst possible one because that had a cover of a gun-toting AK-47 holding African youth. It could have been anywhere with the title, The Hopeless Continent. And if you think at the time, the Balkans had not stabilized, you would never have a cover with a Balkan youth and the cover of Europe as the hopeless continent on the cover. So it just tells you everything you need to know. Or a Sri Lankan kid, child soldier with the caption of hopeless continent referring to Asia. It tells you everything you need to know about Africa, which is a continent that many Western journalists seem to feel they can talk about and write about through sheer ignorance. And what annoyed me so much about that article was that Richard Dowden said it was based on 17 years of his thinking about Africa. Clearly 17 wasted years. He basically situated all the problems within African society and history. He didn't refer once to the 5 centuries of slavery, to colonialism, and even when he was talking about situations of the Cold War, he didn't refer to the fact that countries like the US and France and Belgium were supporting Mobutu in Zaire. They were supporting Siad Barre in Somalia. They were supporting Master Sergeant Samuel Doe. And he talks about Africa in ways that make it seem as if Africa is culturally backward. You know, and these are people that have never learned any African languages. They rely heavily on Western diplomats and World Bank experts as if those are the founts of knowledge. And he was saying things like, there's no point in giving debt relief to Africa because it would basically go to Ukrainian arms dealers. It's so insensitive because it doesn't look at the history of how the World Bank and IMF actually, their structural adjustment policies indebted Africa. The fact that a lot of the aid, so-called aid that was given, went to some of these dictators I talked about. Mobutu was worth allegedly $5 billion by the time he left power. And so you need to look at some of these structural and historical issues. And he didn't give much agency also to Africa. The fact that he said the only reason elections are held in Africa is because of external pressure. So we know here in South Africa that can't be true because you waged a very long civil society-led struggle against it. Likewise, after the Cold War, there were civil society groups and trade unions from Benin to Niger to Zambia to Nigeria that waged a lot of these struggles. So I read this and I was so upset with it. In fact, I saw him at a conference in Oxford shortly after, and I had to restrain myself to verbal jousting.
I'm glad it was just verbal that you had in mind. I mean, you also warn at the same time, Ade, that Pan-Africanism is in need of urgent revival, but you say at the same time that you're concerned about the African Union's ability as a weak organization embarking on sporadic bouts of illusory reforms as the organization that can bring about that revival. Why is that the case?
I think it's important to note that Pan-Africanism was born in America and the Caribbean and not in Africa. And a lot of the church groups from the 18th century, Methodist, African Methodist Church and others that fought against slavery and later against colonialism, later against Mussolini's takeover of Ethiopia, that protested and held the 5 Pan-African conferences between 1919 and 1945. Those were Americans like W.E.B. Du Bois and Caribbeans like George Padmore and Henry Sylvester Williams, and the very prominent but not spoken about South African black woman, Alice Kinloch, who co-organized that first Pan-African conference in London in 1900 with Henry Sylvester Williams. But it was the diaspora that fought that fight before Pan-Africanism at Manchester in 1945 came home, and people like Kwame Nkrumah and Hastings Banda and Awolowo and others took the torch over from them. But what we lost there was what had been a Pan-Africanism of the people became a Pan-Africanism of governments. Pan-Africanism basically became institutionalized in the Organization of African Unity, formed in 1963. And they didn't accept Ghana's and Nkrumah's very ambitious vision of a more federal United States of Africa. And because the Cold War also started, and there were proxy wars, as I said, sponsored by the US, the Soviet Union, France, etc., Pan-Africanism and the OAU were really just struggling. And you had a few important acts of Pan-Africanism, like Randall Robinson and Trans-Africa and the Congressional Black Caucus, fighting apartheid, and in 1986 succeeding in getting economic sanctions imposed on apartheid South Africa. But the African Union, though it's moved away from the sovereignty-obsessed non-intervention principles of the Organization of African Unity, it's still very government-dominated, still very top-down. And its institutions haven't really been that effective. It has, you have to give it credit, done some peacekeeping in Burundi and Darfur, and it currently has about 17,000 peacekeepers in Somalia. But the Pan-African Parliament, which is here in Midrand, is basically a talking shop that doesn't have any legislative powers. You have the African peer review mechanism that 41 countries have joined, but it has no teeth to basically sanction anybody. ECOSOC is the organization through which civil society is meant to engage the African Union, but civil society is really not that strong within the African Union. And then you have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which came into existence in 2018. And it's a good initiative, but it's rather putting the cart before the horse, because Africa has to create 5 strong sub-regional organizations around SADC and ECOWAS and the East African Community and others before it can actually promote genuine regional integration. Our intra-African trade at the moment, it's still only 15% compared to maybe about 50% for Southeast Asia and 60% for the European Union. So the infrastructure gaps within Africa are enormous, something like $300 to $500 billion a year in terms of the gap that's needed for infrastructure. So we still have a lot to do before we can get to a proper union.
I need to ask you about South Africa's integration into the rest of the continent, because there's a feeling that it was largely apartheid that has prevented us from integrating ourselves into this. You can tell me whether you think that's true or not, but certainly even as we involve ourselves in initiatives like the G20, we don't seem to approach that with a sense of Pan-Africanism or a kind of African unity in the way we approach it.
I think on the contrary, South Africa has actually done a very good job. And this is due to a lot of overworked diplomats traveling tirelessly and working their butts off. I think they actually have tried to make it an African G20. The G20 has 20 of the world's richest countries, industrialized countries, and South Africa is the only member. The African Union joined as a member in 2023, but it accounts for about 85% of the world's economic strength. or output. And this is the first ever time that it's come to Africa. I think the South Africans have tried to focus on issues of interest to Africa. So they focused on the debt issue and debt suspension and trying to make sure that the $1.2 billion debt in Africa does not affect economic growth and being able to put money into the social sectors, because 45% of spending typically of African countries goes towards servicing these unpayable debts rather than towards health and education. So it's a big problem, but South Africa has focused on that. The Sustainable Development Goals also, only 35% of those are on track to be met. Those were set in 2015 after the Millennium Development Goals, and they're basically meant to reduce poverty. And we have 5 years before the end, but we're only 35% success. You know, they've only been accomplished. So most of these goals will be missed. South Africa also tried to push very hard on that. And then issues like climate change that are very important for Africa, because Africa is the least polluting continent, but it's the one that is most badly affected by droughts, floods, and famines, etc. South Africa has tried to push very hard on the just energy transition. Critical minerals is another area that South Africa has prioritized in terms of countries and societies within where critical minerals are to be mined, benefiting and coming up with a critical minerals plan to make sure that those communities in those areas and countries in the global south also benefit from it. So I would argue that South Africa has actually made a good go of making this an African G20, focused on African and G20 issues, and also reform of institutions of global governance like the UN, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, is also something that Africans and Global South have pushed. In terms of your other question, it's not clear whether South Africa is the great white hope or the great black hope. And we're still waiting to see 30 years later. But, you know, under apartheid's leaders, they basically saw themselves as part of the West. They were part of the white dominions like Australia and New Zealand and Canada. And many of South Africa's leaders basically talked about themselves as promoting Western civilization in the darkest parts of Africa. You know, John Foster wanted to create a Southern African market that would be dominated by South Africa. And that's the history you have to look at. And even today, even though you've transformed the government and senior sections of the public service, the private sector and most of the wealth within the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and others is still in white hands, still in the hands of a 10% white minority. And so I think that's the schizophrenia that South Africa experiences in terms of becoming an African country. When Thabo Mbeki came back from exile in 1990, he was shocked at what he saw as the slave, what he described as the slave mentality of Black South Africans. And he was like, these South Africans are not quite African, they're European. You know, you'd still hear today when Kaiser Chiefs is playing in Tanzania, we're going to Africa, you know. You still hear that kind of talk even from Black South Africans. And so I never understood until I came to live here in 2003 what Thabo Mbeki was going on about when he was talking about the African Renaissance and saying, I am an African. I mean, what else can you be? And as Ali Mazrui said, he's the only African head of state that could have said that without being marched off to an asylum.
But that segues very nicely to the next question I have for you, which is about the concerns of the university fallists that you write about in this book. And they were, of course, concerned that South Africa's higher education sector reflects an inheritance of 3.5 centuries of colonial and apartheid domination. What do you expect will happen if we don't transform our curricula, Ade?
Well, I think South Africa will continue, with this cultural schizophrenia unless that happens. And the issue that these students were raising, and in the book it was a 2020 book that while I was at the University of Johannesburg heading the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, we commissioned. It was basically inspired by the Rhodes Must Fall student movement in 2015. But we looked at not just UCT, but also Rhodes University and Wits University as well, because there were student movements there trying to transform curricula. And we kept our focus on the humanities curricula, because that's what we knew, basically. I think the logic is, and what we were trying to push, try to learn from the rest of the continent, because South Africa sometimes has a sense of exceptionalism and feels it doesn't have anything to learn from the rest of Africa. And so you go and get a outcomes-based education system from Australia and New Zealand and other places. But you don't look at, for example, the one thing Mugabe did very well, maybe the only thing, is in Zimbabwe, they had a very solid education system. And many of its members you can find in the private sector and academia in South Africa. And they have one of the best trained, and best educated populations on the continent. So are there things that South Africa can learn? So what we tried to do was we took 1994 as South Africa's liberation and went to other African countries that were independent in the 1960s and tried to look at the Ibadan School of History in Nigeria, which was scholars like Kenneth Dike and Adekeye. And they basically tried to write the history of Africa and Nigeria from an African point of view and to challenge much of the prejudiced European narratives that existed in the field. And much of that historiography became the textbooks, not just in universities, but even at secondary and primary level in Nigeria. In Senegal, you had the Dakar School of Culture, people like Sheikh Anta Diop who were trying to do the same in culture. In Tanzania, the Dar es Salaam School of Political Economy, people like Walter Rodney. And in Kenya, you had a Nairobi School of Literature led by people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, trying to look at literature from an African point of view and looking at the world from Africa. I think if South Africa does not move towards trying to consolidate some of these efforts, it will continue being in this cultural limbo with an identity that isn't really that defined, and students who also don't see themselves in the curriculum, because we also had examples from America and African American studies. Much of the push for curriculum transformation from African American and Hispanic American kids came from people who did not see themselves represented in Eurocentric curricula in America. And that's how African American studies and Hispanic American studies came about. And we look at the Atlanta School of Sociology by people like Du Bois already from the 1890s, and the Howard School of International Affairs with people like Merce Tate and Eric Williams writing about international affairs from a different point of view. So those are some of the things that I think are important for South Africa as well, is that you have to have the 80% majority, their history, their epistemologies, their ways of thinking also represented as part of whatever you're teaching.
I want to move abroad. Ade, perhaps I'm not moving abroad because we've been touched by this as well as part of the global village. And this is, of course, the US presidency that I'm talking about. You've written about that in the book as well. Some of the content here predates what has happened in the last few months, which I would say are probably unprecedented in many ways. And of course, Donald Trump, I mean, he's become a hugely divisive figure, but there he is playing on the world stage, putting his name forward very strongly for inclusion as a Nobel Peace Prize winner tomorrow. See if that happens or not. And I'm very interested to hear about what this means for Africa.
Trump, in his first term in 2018, described Africa and Haiti as shithole countries. So we know very clearly what he thinks about Africa. And his cuts, his slashing of the US Agency for International Development, according to the Lancet Medical Journal, could lead to 14 million deaths in the next 5 years, preventable deaths as a result of programs on things like HIV/AIDS and others that have been supported over many years, decades. And what Trump is trying to do, Trump doesn't take Africa or Black people seriously. I see his regime basically as a white supremacist Christian regime. And you could tell from his recent UN speech and much of the Islamophobia, trying to have a Muslim ban, for example, in his first term, exactly where he is, while welcoming all these Christian white Afrikaner farmers as the only migrants that he kind of sees and respects. And I think as Africa is concerned, some of you would have seen the extraordinary meeting that Trump had in the White House. First with Cyril Ramaphosa, with these white golfers and the white billionaire, with everybody trying to basically say South Africa is a crime scene, but we're working on it. And Trump basically trying to play out his prejudices in front of Elon Musk, another awful South African-born character. I don't know quite how to put it, but this is someone that doesn't have any kind of respect for Black people, right from the time he was a real estate developer and was accused of keeping Blacks out of his apartments, putting out a full-page ad trying to get the death penalty for Black youths accused of a murder in Central Park that were later found to have been innocent. All sorts of things that Trump has done. And one thing we must also remember, since I'm not only looking at Africa, but the diaspora, is that he's launched a massive assault on Black history and the history of slavery, which he's tried to erase. So he's threatening to take away funding from the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and trying to say that this history is kind of too accusatory, making white Americans feel guilty, and taking Black figures out of some of military academies in America, and also removing senior Blacks from the Pentagon. He's trying to remove a Black woman now from the Federal Reserve. So this assault on diversity, equity, and inclusion is also, if you like, a part of the global racism that Trump represents. And across the Atlantic in Europe, you see a version of it more quietly in the way that European nations are treating migrants from Africa and the Middle East, and the sorts of things they're saying, like wanting to expel hundreds of thousands of them for committing crimes, even if they're permanent residents. So there is a real global apartheid that's going on around this issue. And I think Trump is the worst representative of this movement.
I'm interested to know, because you've worked very closely with the United Nations over a number of years. And when you observe that sort of involvement, Trump's involvement with what he's saying is going to be a groundbreaking Middle East peace resolution, and when you look at the United Nations response to what has happened in Palestine, right? You've got a UN rapporteur saying there is a genocide that's happened there. And yet you can still have the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressing the United Nations, even though he and several others in his cabinet are accused of war crimes. Do you still see the UN as the kind of toothless body which you framed it as in many ways in this book?
Well, I framed the reforms of the UN as toothless, but I don't think the UN itself is necessarily toothless. You know, the UN has three main mandates, which is security, human rights, and development. In terms of security, the UN has it innovated peacekeeping by about 1948. And half of the peacekeeping missions that it's deployed after the Cold War, 30 out of 58, have been in Africa. And many of those peacekeeping missions have actually been successful and helped to freeze conflict situations or help to restore countries back to health after very destructive civil wars. So in Mozambique, in Sierra Leone, in Burundi, and further afield, in places like El Salvador, the United Nations has actually had successes. Of course, it's also had spectacular failures like Rwanda and Bosnia and Angola. But I wouldn't dismiss the UN outright, because I think if the UN did not exist, we'd have to create something like it. In the area of human rights, you're quite right. The UN has been quite roundly discredited by what the UN Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territories has described as a genocide. Navi Pillay, a very prominent South African who used to head the UN human rights work, is actually the chair of that committee. So we're watching basically what has been described by an arm of the UN of genocide in real time. And, you know, it seems as if the world is quite helpless to do anything about it. And then in terms of development, what happened is that much of development funding doesn't actually go through the UN. The World Bank, the IMF, and bilateral donors tend to be the ones that control much of that funding. And these institutions that are Western dominated, unlike the UN, they have weighted voting, where richer countries and Western countries have more sway in those institutions. So I think we have to understand the UN. It was created 80 years ago after the League of Nations, and the main lessons that its architects drew from the failure of the League of Nations is that it would succeed or fail based on great power cooperation. So it gave veto power to 5 countries, the US, China, Russia, Britain, and France. But the argument is now this needs to be reformed, and we need a new UN Security Council that represents the world of today, not that of 1945. But the UN itself is also coming up with plans to slash programs by 25%, to slash staff by 17%. And I think there's a realization that it has to adapt or die.
You know, Ade, in trying to insulate themselves from the actions of the Trump administration, the obvious move may be for many African countries to rush into the arms of Russia, of China. Certainly that might make sense for South Africa, that is a BRICS partner in the alliance. What do we need to bear in mind when dealing with countries who are also accused of neo-colonial type behavior?
Absolutely. China, I think a country like China is absolutely essential for Africa, but not to swap one dependency of the West on another. we need China to be able to negotiate and use that as leverage to get better deals with the West and Gulf countries and others that want to invest and do business with Africa. So China is the largest trading partner of Africa, $295 billion. It accounts for 50% of Africa's construction sector, a third of its infrastructure. But in places like the DRC, it's also been accused of exploitative mineral deals that are one-sidedly in favor of China. Russia, I don't take too seriously because Russia is about 10% of China's trade in Africa. You know, it's tiny. And most of what Russia is doing is in the extractive sector or providing mercenaries through Wagner, now Africa Corps, to countries like Central African Republic, Mali, Burkina Faso. And I don't think Russia, like France, I think are a bit delusional. They're no longer first-rank powers like China and the US. I think those are the powers we need to be concerned about because those are the ones that have the military, economic, and other heft to be able to maintain this on a long-term basis. But I don't, we need to, of course, deal and trade with Russia as we trade with the EU and France and others. But I think we need to use China's massive investment and trade in Africa to get and negotiate better deals with other external actors. That's where I am.
Ade, there's so much more to ask you, and it doesn't look like I'm going to get to the sport and the travel and the film, all of which are encompassed in this book. But let me just ask you a question that I've been wanting to ask about the issue of reparations. So we've seen countries like Germany, without admitting to a genocide, saying we're paying some kind of compensation that will go towards the government to be used for social services and that kind of thing. Do we have the right to? Can we feasibly demand reparations? Would the West be open to that? And how would that? What sort of form would that take?
Yeah, I think of course we don't need the permission of the West to ask for reparations. We must ask for what we think is right. And the one genocide that Germany admitted to was, of course, the Jewish Holocaust.
Yes.
And it paid $98 billion in compensation. In the case of Namibia, it apologized and more or less acknowledged the genocide against the Herero. Between 1904 and 1908, the Germans basically wiped out 80% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama in the 20th century's first genocide. And many people actually feel that this was a dress rehearsal for the Jewish Holocaust, which happened 2 decades later, because a lot of the concentration camps and experiments they were doing with skulls and all sorts of things were done already in Namibia 2 decades earlier. So what Germany eventually did in 2021 is they offered 1.1 billion euros over a 20-year period in development and other programs to assist those communities that had been affected. Part of why Germany also did not want to clearly accept responsibility was because there are other countries like Poland and others in Eastern Europe that could have also tried to get reparations from Germany. But, a lot of people try simplistically to reduce reparations to money, but it's not about money. It's about restitution. It's about acknowledgement. And if you look at the African Union's Abuja 1993 declaration, what Abuja was arguing was for debt relief, was for the return of artifacts and African art, was for transformation of institutions of global governance. So it wasn't just a cash transfer, and for closer relations with the diaspora. And what later, 3 decades later, the more recent Accra Proclamation of 2023, which the African Union did with CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, they're wanting to establish a global fund for reparations, which people can pay into, and work with the UN to develop mitigation plans. But one of the most famous reparations plans is the Caribbean 10-point plan. And that calls for things like apologies, contribution to health, contribution to education, the money that was paid to white slave owners to be paid back to those countries. And the Church of England also set up £100 million fund because it was found out by researchers that they were actually benefiting from slavery. So you had God and the devil marching in lockstep in that time. So there are other institutions like Harvard, Glasgow, Oxford, Yale that have also set up restitution programs. And that could be scholarships for Caribbean children and things like that. So there are many, many ways of actually having this restitution other than just to try to reduce it to asking for cash. And the African Union, my last point, has declared this year as the year of reparations for African people and people of African descent, which is extended to a decade. But this is a fight that I think, and a movement that I think is a just cause. And there is absolutely no reason. In fact, Trump being in the White House is even more of a reason why we should continue to push for it.
Ade, thank you for sharing those beautiful thoughts. I'd like to open it up to the floor now, because I think I've hogged Ade for long enough. We don't have a roving mic in the audience, so I'm going to ask you to please throw your voice when you ask your question. But please, go ahead.
Two questions. First of all, congratulations, Prof, for the book. You have a chapter in the book that you did not speak about, titled "God is not an African." And you were reflecting on the appointment or the election of Pope Francis as Pope, and how it dashed the hopes that we have an African Pope. Now Pope Francis is dead, we have an American Pope. What is your reflection about an American Pope against a very cantankerous and American president? And of course, another hope for Africa's Pope dashed once again. What is your reflection about Pope Leo on that? And my second question is, in as much as we talk about Kwame Nkrumah and how he was very determined to have a federalized African continent, was he the right person to do this? And I'm saying this because we kind of deify him as people have studied Pan-Africanism, but I'm speaking from the perspective of what Joshua Nkomo wrote about in his autobiography, when he said in his private talks, Nkrumah, that is, in his private talks with Joshua Nkomo of Zimbabwe and Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, Nkrumah wanted the Congo so that he could just control it. He actually said, the Congo is a mess, why don't they just give it to me so that I can control it? So he wanted to federalize Africa, but with himself as leader. What would you say about that?
Yeah. So in terms of Nkrumah, like every other figure, Nkrumah wasn't without his faults. You know, the Kenyan Ali Mazrui I mentioned earlier wrote one of the most famous incidents after the fall of Nkrumah in 1966, called Nkrumah the Leninist Tsar, you know, after he fell. And he basically argued that Nkrumah had suffered from autocratic and monarchical excess and lost the organization skills of a kind of Leninist party. And he also accused him of having pioneered and led the one-party state in Africa, because of course Nkrumah introduced autocracy and banned other parties and tried to democratize civil society and get trade unions and other movements supporting the government. So Nkrumah wasn't without his faults, but I think you have to give Nkrumah credit for both his vision and what he did to fight for African independence and Ghanaian independence both in the 50s and 60s. And his foreign policy was also visionary. The fact his vision wasn't achieved doesn't mean that he doesn't deserve credit in that particular area, you know. So I would say, look at Nkrumah like any other heroes. All heroes are flawed to some extent. And then in regard to your question about the Pope and Trump, I think what I'd say is that the representative of both God and the devil are American.
Okay, any more questions from the audience? Okay, may I take the lady first, then I'll take you.
Thank you very much. I really look forward to reading your book. Yeah, so I just want to say that you mentioned the Pan-African conferences that happened. And I don't think a lot has been done to actually collate that archival material from those Pan-African conferences. So I think that would be very interesting, because there are people who have written about them, but I don't think they've gone into the archives that exist in Africa, because some of those conferences actually did happen on the African continent. So I think that would be a very fascinating topic of exploration. But then, just regarding the question of reparations, so I actually asked someone called Lumumba King. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yes, that's Patrick Bond's friend.
Yes. So I said, well, I didn't ask him directly, but I was like, why don't African countries just ask for reparations? And he was like, because the governments won't ask for any reparations, because the governments are working with the neoliberal elites, right? So they're not going to ask for reparations. They're never going to ask for that. And then, you know, my question is, do we want something just like a better deal from another, you know, imperial power like China? Is that what we want? Or do we want something more dangerous? Do we want to have our own resources in Africa for ourselves? So yeah, you're taking out a whole binder.
Yeah,
I feel very intimidated. But I'm just like,
to be well prepared.
you were hoping someone would ask this question. You were hoping someone would say, I'm glad I obliged. Thank you.
Okay, so you've asked about China and Africanism, and what was your third
The
one?
Pan-African conferences and archival record
Okay.
about, do we just want a better deal from China, like, or do we want something more dangerous? Something that Patrice Lumumba was actually killed for, which is control of our own resources here. He was murdered because he proposed that the Congo nationalize their own resources.
Okay, thank you. So let me try to answer. African governments are actually asking for reparations, so that is not a problem. It's including South Africa. Yes. Oh, sorry. Including South Africa. It's the people that are meant to give the reparations that are resisting. But both African governments and civil society and Caribbean governments, the CARICOM plan that I mentioned earlier, the 10-point plan, definitely that's all part of reparations and restitution. It's just they're not necessarily asking for a lump sum, although some in the Caribbean have done those figures in terms of what 200 years of unpaid labor is worth. But yes, they are. But if you provided reparations, in fact, that could be one of the reparations, debt cancellation. That's what the OAU was proposing in 1993, debt annulment as part of a reparations. So there are many ways of doing it, of skinning the cat, but I don't think we should assume that the problem here is that the Africans aren't demanding it. They are demanding it, some more loudly than others. In terms of China, I think I've talked about what we should do with China in terms of using China's trade and investment to leverage and have better negotiations with other countries as well. But, you know, it's not just as simple as Africa controlling its own resources. We don't know what we have beneath our surfaces, and we often need technology from elsewhere to be able to find it and get it out. We're not beneficiating also. So you need to add value to these materials or raw minerals when you get them out, so that you can turn iron ore into bauxite and get more money for it as well. So it's a lot more complicated than just us declaring that we're going to hold on to our minerals. I think there's a lot more that we need to think about, and all sorts of strategic partnerships that we could come up with to make sure that we benefit and make sure we're also able to have better control of getting out these resources, adding value to them, marketing them, selling them, etc. That's going to require a lot of thought and long-term planning, the type that China had in actually controlling much of the rare earth minerals today. That was a 20, 30-year plan that it had. So we need to also be that prepared as well. And then the Pan-African conferences all took place in America and Europe. Lisbon, London, New York, the ones between 1900 and 1945, the 6. The ones that have taken place in Africa are kind of like some that have taken place in Kampala. There's another one coming up in Lomé, Togo in December. But those conferences that have been organized by civil society, often in partnership with governments, and some of them autocratic governments, not everybody actually acknowledges and recognizes them as, you know, they don't give them the same status as the previous 5 or 6 that happened.
There was one in Accra.
Yes, yeah. I think there have been about maybe 4, you know.
Thank you. Lovely questions. Patrick?
Yeah, I'm Patrick from UJ. In fact, I'm sure I would have told you, but I came to UJ 4 years ago, because you were there.
And then he left, yes.
Questions about South Africa and Africa. I agree with everything you've said, except you're way too generous. I mean, just 3 quick ones. Climate. Do we not have an environment minister named Leon George? You can see his online CV bragging about serving national service. 1980s SADF, national service. So this is a guy who last year won reparations 11 months ago were on the agenda at Baku, and Evans and Jay with it, Malawi, leader of the LDCs, the least developed country. He walks out, brings 50 countries out. So where does our guy sit? Where does South Africa sit? With Africa or with the West and the BRICS, refusing reparations on climate? Polluter pays. We have it in our own legislation, but we won't apply it because we're the 4th highest emitter in the world per person per unit of GDP. Second, another, I think, grotesque figure in Africa, Trevor Manuel. And that's the man Ramaphosa put in charge of managing the debt. He's the chair of Old Mutual, deputy chair of Rothschild. The portfolios there include African debt. He's not going to get any debt relief. He's not going to do anything to help the masses of Africa. He's shown that in his promotion of Gear. It's the worst neoliberal failure we've ever had. And Ramaphosa puts him in the G20 position here. This is not an anti-imperial posture in the G20 in favor of Africa. It's a sub-imperial. And the third, I think, would have to be the military. If you look at the last dozen years, could you justify going to the Central African Republic on behalf of Chancellor House, Paramount Group, deals for arms, for diamonds, for oil, or northern Mozambique, because Macron asked Ramaphosa to put the troops there to support Total, to create more climate catastrophe through methane gas, creating more cyclones up there. Our troops are there, and then they couldn't work very well there. The Rwandans did much better, so they were put in the eastern DRC. And there, it's not just our telephones which get the children's labor from Chinese mines that South African troops are defending. It's Bobby Godsell, Anglo-American, who went with the warlords accused by Human Rights Watch of promoting a genocide in eastern DRC. And then it's Patrice Motsepe, who is today sending coal to Israel. Those mines, those sub-imperial facilities of South African capital, named the most corrupt by PwC in the Economic Crime and Fraud Circuit. Hey, my friend, you're being way too generous. We need a big
do you see Ramaphosa's hand in the DRC?
I don't want to say that, no, I'm not doing that.
So you're actually more careful.
I'm more careful now.
Your man.
But let me be, last point, very brief. By asking you, Ade, won't you join me in suggesting, given the critique we share of the racist, imperialist Donald J. Trump, killing 14 million people, Elon Musk helping, why don't we have a vote in the G20 and make it a G19, vote him off the island? Where is the bravery in the AU and the Pretoria regime to actually put the simple question, do we go to Nazareth and make lots of grand pronouncements about climate, about African debt, about food sovereignty, about inequality, about global taxation, and then in the Miami Doral Country Club, where Donald Trump hosts the 2026 G20, and in 2027 in London with Nigel Farage, the Prime Minister, is all thrown out. Do we want that, or isn't it time for some quality control? Couldn't you lend your voice to a question? Vote Trump off the G20 island before it's too late. It's only about 5 weeks away. We've got to do
Thank you.
Sounds like a great reality show, by the way, Patrick.
He was heading a reality show, The Apprentice.
Yeah.
So he knows what he's talking about. Thanks, Prof. Patrick. Always provocative and on point. I think in terms of, first of all, we must put this in context. The US is taking over the G20 from South Africa next month. So whatever South Africa hands over as a report is dead on arrival. So let's be very clear about that. Trump has made very clear that he wants to drill, baby, drill, that he thinks the whole climate change thing is a hoax, and he boycotted the development conference that the UN held in Seville a couple of months ago. So let's look at things also within that context. You know, a lot of what we're talking about here is shadow boxing, because the reality is going to be very different. And many people have actually pushed for a kind of strategy where South Africa does as much work as it can, but then tries to embed some of these ideas and policies within the AU and the UN, you know, so that there can be some continuity. But having them within the G20 when there's a US presidency, they're not going to go anywhere. And Trump has made very clear where his priorities are. Maybe the critical minerals work is the only one that may interest Trump and the US administration. So let's look at things. I'm quite realistic about what the G20 can achieve. And the G20 has not been, you know, it has no secretariat, it has no implementing arm. And so, you know, my ambitions for a G20 resolution are not that high. But I do want to acknowledge the work that the South Africans have done, because they have limited resources and they have limited capacity. But those diplomats have bust their asses. So they're the ones, those diplomats in DERCO, that I'm really praising, not your environment minister. I read your chapter very carefully, your rich chapter with Martha Bekele, the Ethiopian civil society activist that you submitted to us. And so I know that South Africa has protected a lot of these corporations within South Africa itself and let them get away with murder when it relates to taxes, etc. So I have no issues with that. But on the basis of advocacy And where I've been in lots of meetings with DECO people, what they've said and their advocacy has been quite effective for me. So it's not perfect.
Talk left, walk right.
Yeah, that's what your book was called. I'm not a fan of Trevor Manuel. I don't think he's very effective. I don't think he's any kind of intellectual. In fact, his girlfriend that became his wife is more impressive, if anything. And she headed, of course, Absa Bank, Maria Ramos. Yeah. I think she's more impressive intellectually than Trevor Manuel. But I think, Prof. Patrick, we must not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I don't think that committee is going to write a report and make recommendations, which the US presidency is going to ignore. So that's what's effectively going to happen in reality. So I'm not saying everything the G20 has done or the people they've picked are all correct. But I'm saying that in terms of their advocacy, they focused on the right issues. Issues like reforming global governance institutions, debt, SDGs, are not issues that me and you would disagree on. Whether they can actually be implemented is another issue. But South Africa, in its chair of the G20, had to pick some issues and had to run with them. And I think in that limited goal, they've managed to do quite a good job, in my view. In terms of advocacy, not necessarily what will happen. Central African Republic, I wasn't supporting that intervention in 2013. That was a botched intervention where 13 South African soldiers died. And the Zuma administration didn't really explain what it was doing there. And the mission itself fell within two stools of peacekeeping and peace enforcement. And in the end, they didn't have enough troops there to protect themselves when they were attacked. Likewise, DRC is actually a very troubling situation for me. The fact that Kagame was able to force a South African withdrawal from the DRC, along with Tanzania and Malawi, the SADC force, should be very troubling for South Africa's role as a regional power, because what it exposed was a 71,000 army that is contributing 65% of its budget to paying salaries for that army, and an air force in which 85% of its assets are not working. South Africa's military capacity was very badly exposed. That's why they pulled out of Mozambique. And going into the eastern DRC is like going from the fire to the frying pan. So I don't really understand it. That's why I was asking you about Ramaphosa's own ideas and thinking for going in there. But I've certainly heard many of those allegations of mining interest and economic interest accounting for South Africa going in there. But it doesn't make any sense from a military point of view to go in there with a Congolese army, is badly equipped, ill-disciplined, committing abuses, and saying you want to secure a territory where 100 militias are operating. It was sheer madness for me.
Any more? Yes, let's have a question here and then we'll take yours.
Hi,
Yes?
Prof. I just wanted
Hello.
to find out your take on...
Who are you?
I'm Heidi. I haven't read your book also, but I just wanted to find out how you feel about the new Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traore. What's your take on his ideologies? I mean, he's basically saying, stuff the Western world. We're going full-on Pan-African.
But he has French bodyguards, doesn't he, Adek?
Oh, does he?
I believe he
didn't know
does.
that. Okay. Traore, I think, is a very intelligent young man, talks a lot of sense, and I think him, Niger, Mali were absolutely correct to get France and French troops out of their countries. So to that extent, I support what the Alliance of Sahel States were doing. But I do think we can't shy away from the fact that this is a military government that is clamping down on dissent, doesn't allow any free speech, and is committing abuses and jailing people in an arbitrary way. I also think that they're a bit delusional in the sense that they left ECOWAS, which is their biggest market, in January 2025. And they somehow think that they're going to be able to industrialize without adequate capital, without enough entrepreneurs and capitalists, and without harnessing their efforts to the larger ECOWAS market, even though both sides have said they will still allow free movement of people and goods and things like that. So I'm not really sure that they can pull off what they're saying. And they have very good propagandists on social media touting all the great industrial achievements and accomplishments and farming achievements they've achieved, but it's not real. It's AI generated. So I think that the young man is smart and is absolutely correct to get rid of French dependency, but I'm not sure that in the long run you're going to be able to develop your country without the participation of people. And I think they're far too optimistic in terms of their vision for industrializing. And they're still tied to the French-led currency zone as well, while calling for independence. So it's a mixed bag, Heidi, a mixed bag, unfortunately.
Thank you. We had a question here. Yes.
Hi, Prof. Ramwande. So you mentioned from the 16 SDGs that Africa has only achieved the suffering in 35%.
The world.
Oh, okay. I thought it was specifically in relation to Africa. Because the question was then going to be around the 2030 being around the corner. Which of the 65 not yet achieved that you feel if Africa were to focus on, it can kind of have a positive spin overs that can erode those that will still have not yet been met?
Yeah, thank you. You know, we only have 5 years to go. And if you take even a situation like food security, if you take health, tackling hunger, all these things that are relating to poverty, all of them are a priority for us in a way. You take climate and the kind of impacts that's having, youth unemployment, those sorts of things. So I'm not sure that you can say that in 5 years, it's clear that the world is not just Africa, the world is not going to achieve most of them. But if you're saying what should we focus on in the next 5 years, I would say how to manage the debt and suspend them, because that is preventing, as I said, 45% of African countries, most African countries, or many African countries, putting 45% to servicing debt. It means they don't have enough money to put into the social sector. So that needs to be tackled. Debt suspension or cancellation, if possible, has to be one of our major priorities. I think the climate is also a major priority, as Prof. Patrick and others have made clear. And we can see the impacts of that every day, even in KwaZulu-Natal, where you are from. All the droughts in Nigeria. Niger State keeps getting flooded every year. The Sahel region of Africa, Southern Africa's drought. It affects farming, it affects everything else. that also has to be a major priority that we're going to need to tackle. And because of all these aid cuts, not just by the US, which do it loudly, but by the Europeans, which are more quiet, we will need to also take care of health. COVID showed us how vulnerable we are. Our health sectors are very vulnerable and very fragile, and we'll need to develop and build up that resilience now in a situation of very limited resources and support. So those are some of the areas I would say we need to zoom in on, not just for the next 5 years though, but going forward, even beyond that.
Thank you. Yes?
Thank you both for such a great discussion. I'm Sue, by the way. I love the questions, and the answers are truly thought-provoking and stimulating in the best way. I wondered if you, I don't have the clever questions of some of the other audience. I wondered if you would feel comfortable chatting a bit about growing up and when you realised that inequality, that you were on the wrong side of that inequality, and there was something that you could do and bring to the world that only you can, that has changed it in such a fundamental way. Thank you.
Wow, that's a difficult question. Are you sure I'm on the wrong side? I may be on the right side, but in the wrong place.
Yes. I think several decades ago, it seemed everyone was on the wrong side.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure. It's a difficult one, Sue, because it's like one of those, what would Jesus have done type of questions, you know? But I see what you're saying. I think for me, I don't think by the way that I've moved things, I think I'm a very small cog in the wheel, and I've tried to advocate, and I've also headed a conflict resolution, two centers, one on conflict resolution, one on Pan-Africanism for 18 years. And what I've tried to do is to build up the strength of Africa's regional organization and also their research capacity, because many of them are understaffed and don't have time or the capacity to be able to do long-term thinking. So those are some of the contributions that I think I've tried to make to the AU, to SADC, to ECOWAS. And we've also worked a lot directly with strengthening African human rights institutions and trying to capacitate women to be able to take part in mediation processes in Africa. So those are things that I did at the Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town over many years. And I've also tried to kind of raise awareness and influence policy in a kind of public intellectual role, speaking truth to power, as Palestinian American Edward Said encouraged us all to do. So in a way, that's what I've tried to do. I realized I was maybe from the wrong side of the tracks when I spent 8 years in a British boarding school from the age of 10 till I was 18. And I knew, and then I went back to Nigeria, but I knew where the fight was. And I think England makes very clear to you that you don't completely belong to the place, you know? You're an Afro-Saxon. Yes, exactly. So I know you wanted a bit more personal, Sue, but that's why I speak like this. The Brits have messed up my accent.
Any more questions, Patrick? One more? Shall we close with you? Or yeah?
Just very quick, because I mean, Sue's put us on the right track, which is those 18 years. Okay, elite institutions, elite politics. Now the next 18. What about what happened in Morocco last week? Mass uprising. Kids wearing keffiyeh. They didn't like the socio-economic injustice. They didn't like the Malacca print. They didn't like the Abraham Accords. Or 2 weeks before, the Malagasis. Uprising, unprecedented. or the week before, Tunisian workers, or 3 weeks before, the Kenyan Gen Z 2.0. Hey, there's things that are happening from below. That's my Afro-optimism, isn't it? Yours as well, the next 18 years.
It's my Afro-optimism and also my Afro-fears, you know, Prof. Patrick. Because you see, if we have something like 70% of Africa's population are under the age of 30, and a lot of these youths don't have jobs. And not all of them are going to be able to risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean or the Atlantic to try to get to Europe. So these uprisings have the potential for positive change, but they also have the potential for chaos in Africa. So I'm not saying we should stop them, because there's no way of stopping them, but we should try to direct them in the right, in positive directions. And that's my hope. You know, I'm also from a Nigeria that had EndSARS in 2020. We've never seen anything like it. And we have such a complacent elite. They still think they're the giants of Africa. They're still, they're so delusional and lost, the older generation. So they're definitely going to be shaken up. And it was Sudan, it was Algeria, and there are many other places where youths are highly mobilized. And we're going to see a lot more of these uprisings going forward. So for sure, we're going to see it. But I would urge you, Prof. Patrick, as one of the Pied Pipers leading these youths, not to lead them astray.
Is that the note on which you're going to end? Issuing a warning to Patrick Bond publicly, which has been recorded, by the way. Ade, I think we're going to leave it there. I mean, I think it has been a wonderful evening of intellectual interaction and debate. I think some of the best content has come from you as the audience. I want to thank you for that. And Ade, as always, I want to thank you for your fascinating insights and for the patience with which you are able to record all of these. So important for the archive that we are building as Africans and the diaspora. And of course, speaking of archiving, Kate has ensured that all of these wonderful talks and launches that we do end up on Love Books YouTube channel. That's right, they're on the YouTube channel. So for those of us who did not make it tonight because of the rain and inclement weather, just spread the word that in a few days' time you'll be able to find this recording and you'll be able to listen in detail to what Ade has had to say this evening. But I want to thank you for coming out this evening. And Kate, thank you to you and your team for the warm embrace in here. And please get yourself a copy of Africa's Splendid Tapestry. I think I'm going to be using this for all sorts of purposes for many, many years to come. So, Ade, thank you for the wonderful work.
Thanks very much, everybody.
For making yourself available.